The cold did not arrive like a guest, it was the owner of the land, returning to reclaim its property. She felt it in the marrow of her bones, a deep, resonant ache that the thin autumn sun could not touch. They had given her until sundown to be gone, and the sun was now a bleeding smear on the horizon, staining the clouds with a final, indifferent glory. Her dog, a great shepherd whose coat was the color of sable and shadow, pressed against her leg, a silent anchor in a world that had come unmoored. The settlement was a collection of smudged shapes behind her, its feeble lights already surrendering to the encroaching dusk. In front of her lay the foothills, a rumpled blanket of rock and stunted juniper, rising toward mountains that clawed at the sky like an animal's bones. The decree had been read by the elder, his voice as dry and brittle as the husks of last year's corn. She was to be expunged, her presence a violation of their tidy, fearful order. Her crime was solitude. Her sin was refusing to be yoked to another man after her husband's passing, refusing to surrender her patch of stony earth to the communal good. "It is for your own protection," the elder had said, his eyes avoiding hers. A lone woman cannot survive the winter that is coming. It was not a warning, it was a verdict. She carried what she could, a canvas sack with a meager portion of flour, a tin of salt, a water skin, and the tools that had belonged to her husband. A pickaxe with a handle worn smooth by his hands, a shovel, a heavy mallet. They were her inheritance, more precious than coin or creed. The dog whined softly, a low thrum in its chest. She laid a hand on its head, her fingers sinking into the thick fur. His name was Fen, and his presence was the only warmth she had left. She did not look back. To look back was to acknowledge what was lost, and she had no time for that. Survival was a forward-facing thing. Her gaze was fixed on a particular outcropping of rock, a place her husband had spoken of in a low voice late one night, his words tracing the lines of a memory from his own grandfather. A place of shallow caves, of soft stone that could be worked. He had called it the earth's embrace. Now, it was her only hope. The air grew thinner, sharper. Each breath was a sliver of ice in her lungs. The land was not empty, as the settlers believed. It was full of a vast, sleeping power, and she was a trespasser on its skin. But she was not asking for permission. She was planning to endure. She found it as the last light failed, a shallow scoop in a wall of weathered sandstone, more a suggestion of shelter than a true cave. It was a wound in the rock, barely deep enough to shield a person from the wind if they curled themselves into a question mark. She dropped her sack and tools, the sound muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles that had collected over decades. The air inside smelled of damp stone and decay. Fen sniffed the perimeter, his tail low, his posture a study in canine vigilance. She ran her palm over the rock face. It was coarse, gritty, and in the deep twilight, it seemed to breathe a cold that was ancient and profound. She had no fire tonight. To make one would be to announce her position, a foolish waste of energy when the real work had not yet begun. She pulled her thin blanket from the sack, wrapped it around her shoulders, and sat with her back against the stone, the dog curled tightly against her side. Sleep was a distant country she could not reach. Instead, she listened. She heard the scuttling of some small, nocturnal creature, the sigh of the wind as it moved through the skeletal branches of the junipers, the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart. This was the true beginning. Not the decree, not the walk away from the silent, judging faces. This. The silence, the cold, the unyielding stone at her back. She thought of her husband, not his face in sickness, but the strength in his hands as he had built their small cabin, the one that now belonged to the community. He had known how to work with his hands, how to read the language of wood and soil. She had watched, and she had learned. The knowledge was there, dormant in her muscles and her mind. She picked up the pickaxe, its weight familiar and strange. In the darkness, she could do little, but she could begin. She swung it, not with force, but with a testing motion, the metal tip striking the back wall of the alcove. The sound was a dull thud, and a shower of sand and small pebbles rained down. The rock was soft, as he had said. It would yield. It would take time, a currency she had in abundance. It would take all of her strength, a resource she would have to mine from the depths of her own will. The cold came searching then, its fingers probing the edges of her blanket. She pressed closer to Fen, burying her face in his ruff, and closed her eyes. She was not building a grave. She was digging her way back to life. The days bled into a rhythm of labor. Dawn would break, a slow, grey dilution of the night, and she would already be working. The pickaxe became an extension of her arm, its sharp point her iron will made manifest. She learned to read the stone, to see the faint, almost invisible lines of fracture, the subtle changes in color that signaled a weaker seam. She did not fight the rock, she persuaded it. A series of sharp taps here, a deep, leveraged blow there, and a slab would groan, protest, and then break free. The sound of its fall echoed in the narrow space, a percussive punctuation to the ceaseless whisper of the wind. She hauled the broken pieces out of the deepening cavity, her muscles screaming in protest. At first, she simply discarded them, creating a growing scree slope below the entrance. But then, a new thought took root, a practical seed planted by the memory of her grandfather building a spring house. She began to sort the stones. The large, irregular chunks were still cast aside, but the flatter, more uniform pieces, she saved. She stacked them carefully to one side, creating a low, growing wall of raw material. Her hands, once soft, were now tools in their own right, calloused and mapped with a geography of cuts and scrapes. The work consumed her. It left no room for grief or fear. There was only the next swing of the pickaxe, the next stone to be levered free, the next load to be carried. Her body, starved of excess, burned away its softness, leaving behind a framework of lean muscle and sinew. She moved with a deliberate economy, no motion wasted. Fen was her constant companion. He would lie at the mouth of the burgeoning cave, a sentinel watching the approaches, his ears twitching at every distant sound. He never barked. It was a silence they both understood, a shared pact of invisibility. Sometimes, he would nudge her hand with his wet nose, a reminder to stop, to drink from the skin, to eat a small handful of the gritty flour mixed with water into a crude paste. He was the keeper of her dwindling humanity. One afternoon, she saw a figure watching from the ridge opposite her hollow. It was the young man, Reese, the one whose eyes had held pity instead of judgment. He stood there for a long time, a silhouette against the pale sky. He did not approach. When he finally left, she found a small bundle where he had stood, a half-loaf of dark bread and a piece of dried meat. She ate it slowly, methodically, the taste of salt and grain an explosion on her tongue. She did not know if it was an act of kindness or of guilt, and she decided it did not matter. She left nothing in return. There were no transactions here, only existence. The air grew a sharper tooth. The mornings were laced with a frost that looked like a layer of fine ash upon the land. The sun, when it appeared, was a pale, watery disk that offered no real warmth. Anya knew her time of excavation was drawing to a close. The cave was now a proper room, perhaps 12 feet deep and 8 feet wide, the ceiling high enough for her to stand upright. The raw, chipped walls seemed to drink the light, creating a perpetual twilight within. But it was open, a gaping mouth exposed to the elements. The wall of sorted stone she had built was her next great task. She needed mortar. She remembered watching her husband mix it for their chimney, the simple alchemy of the earth. She found a vein of dense clay near a small, half-frozen creek bed, its color a rich, dark ochre. She dug it out with her shovel, her fingers numb from the cold mud, and carried it back in pieces of her canvas sack. She mixed it with sand from the cave floor and a little water, pounding and turning it with the flat of her shovel until it had the thick, sticky consistency she remembered. The work was slower, more meticulous than the brute force of digging. Each stone had to be chosen, its shape and weight considered. She would lift a flat piece of sandstone, spread a thick layer of the clay mortar onto the course below, and then carefully set the new stone in place, wiggling it until it felt secure. It was a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, and she was the sole architect. The wall rose, a single stone at a time. It was a crude thing, uneven and blotched with the dark mortar, but it was solid. It was hers. She worked until her arms trembled with fatigue, until the mortar froze to her fingers, and then she would retreat into the cave, huddling with Fen for warmth, her body humming with the ghost of the day's labor. She left an opening, a narrow gap that would serve as a doorway, and a smaller, square hole higher up that would be a window, for now covered with a piece of stretched hide. The structure grew, a testament not to hope, but to a stubborn refusal to perish. It was a physical manifestation of her defiance, a wall against the world that had cast her out. From a distance, it looked like a natural part of the cliff face, a strange, geometric scarring on the rock. The townsfolk, if they looked this way at all, would see nothing but stone. They would assume the wilderness had swallowed her? But she was not being swallowed. She was taking root. She was becoming as permanent and unyielding as the rock itself. A home required a heart. The cold was a living entity, and the stone, while a formidable shield against the wind, held a deep, penetrating chill of its own. Without a fire, the cave would become a tomb of ice. She had identified the place weeks ago, a solid section of the back wall, directly below a vertical fissure she'd discovered running up through the rock. The fissure was her hope for a flue. Creating the hearth was an act of brutal, intimate sculpture. She used the pickaxe for the rough work, chipping away a semicircular space at the base of the wall, her blows ringing in the confined space until her ears hummed. The sound was deafening, the effort immense. She worked in near darkness, the light from the entrance barely reaching this deep. Sweat ran into her eyes, stinging them with salt, and the dust was a constant choke in her throat. Once the basic shape was hollowed out, she switched to a smaller hammer and a sharp-edged piece of granite she'd found, using it as a chisel. This was finer work, shaping the firebox, ensuring the back wall sloped correctly to throw the heat out into the room. Then came the flue, the most dangerous and critical part. She had to chip upwards, carefully, tirelessly, widening the natural fissure into a channel for the smoke. Small avalanches of rock and dirt rained down on her, covering her head and shoulders. She worked with a piece of hide wrapped around her head, her eyes squinted shut against the debris, striking upwards into the dark, guided more by feel than by sight. It took 3 full days of this torturous, vertical work before she finally broke through to a wider part of the fissure near the cliff top. A trickle of cold, fresh air on her face was her reward, a sign that the passage was clear. She built the hearth itself from the smoothest, flattest stones she had left, mortaring them into place to create a safe, solid base. The moment of truth arrived on a grey, windless evening. She gathered a small pile of dry juniper twigs and the last of the scavenged wood she'd found. She arranged it carefully in the new fireplace, her hands trembling slightly. Using her flint and steel, she struck a spark into a small nest of dried grass. It caught, a tiny, fragile ember. She blew on it gently, nurturing it, feeding it the smallest twigs. The flame grew, and with it, a plume of grey smoke. For a heart-stopping moment, the smoke billowed out into the cave, threatening to choke her. But then, as if taking its first breath, the column of smoke wavered, caught the draft, and began to flow upwards, disappearing into the dark maw of the flue. A steady, gentle draw began. The fire crackled, its light dancing on the raw stone walls, turning the grim cavern into a room. The warmth began to push back the ancient cold, creating a small bubble of life in the vast, frozen emptiness. She sat before it, the light flickering on her face, and felt a profound, quiet triumph. It was more than a fire. It was a declaration. The world began to lose its color. The muted greens and browns of the foothills were bleached by the relentless cold, then buried under a preliminary dusting of snow. The sky was a permanent, oppressive lid of bruised gray. The wind honed itself into a blade, carrying the scent of a deeper, more profound winter from the high peaks. From her vantage point, Anya could see the settlement below, a cluster of wooden boxes puffing smoke into the sullen air. She watched them as they prepared, seeing the men felling the last of the nearby trees, their axes flashing in the weak light. She saw them banking the foundations of their houses with dirt and straw. They were fighting the coming cold with wood and prayer, the same way they always had. Their methods were known, their wisdom passed down through generations of settlers who had tamed softer lands than this. This land was different. It did not yield to the axe so easily. It demanded a different kind of respect, a deeper understanding. One morning, Reese appeared again, closer this time, at the edge of the scree slope below her entrance. He was bundled in furs, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He carried a heavy wool blanket. Fen stood at the cave mouth, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but he did not advance. Anya appeared in the doorway, a shadow against the faint glow of her fire within. "The elder says a storm is coming," Reese called out, his voice thin against the wind. "Like none before. The old trappers feel it. The animals have all gone to ground." He held out the blanket. "This will not be enough for you here." Anya looked at the offering, then at the young man's worried face. His pity had not hardened into scorn, as it had with the others. It had ripened into a genuine concern that was both touching and naive. "I will be ready," she said. Her voice was steady, calm. It was not a boast, but a simple statement of fact. He looked past her, trying to see into the darkness of the cave. He could likely smell the wood smoke, see the solidity of the stone wall she had built. His expression was a mixture of confusion and awe. "You cannot fight a blizzard with rocks," he insisted, a note of desperation in his voice. "This isn't a place for living." "It's a tomb." She did not reply. She simply looked at him, her silence a more powerful answer than any words. The stone around her was not a tomb. It was a womb. It was the body of the earth itself, and she had found a place in its heart. He eventually laid the blanket down on a flat rock and retreated, casting one last, troubled look over his shoulder. She took the blanket inside. It was a fine, heavy thing, and she was grateful for it. But her true security was not woven from wool. It was built of clay and stone and a wool that the wind could not shatter. It began not as snow, but as a change in the quality of the light, a sickening yellow-gray that swallowed the horizon. The wind fell away into an unnerving silence. The world seemed to be holding its breath. Anya brought the last of her firewood inside and secured a heavy, cured hide over the doorway, lashing it down tight. She checked the small pile of dried berries and roots she had managed to forage, the sack of flour. It was not much, but it would be enough. Then the blizzard struck. It was not a storm, it was a physical assault. A solid wall of white descended, and the world beyond her stone wall ceased to exist. The wind was a solid thing, a roaring, screaming beast that threw itself against the cliff face. The sound was immense, a deafening symphony of geological rage. Yet inside, the core of the sound was muffled. The tons of rock surrounding her absorbed the main fury of the gale, reducing its terrifying scream to a deep, resonant hum, like the sound of a giant sleeping. The fire in her hearth burned steadily, its smoke drawn cleanly up the flue. The flames cast a warm, flickering orange light across the stone, making the rough walls pulse with life. The air was warm and still. Fen, who would normally be agitated by a storm, was curled on the floor near the hearth, his head on his paws, sleeping as peacefully as if it were a summer afternoon. Anya sat on a low stone bench she had built into the wall, mending a tear in her tunic. Her movements were slow, deliberate. There was no fear. There was, instead, a profound sense of peace. Every stone she had lifted, every swing of the pickaxe, every moment of back-breaking labor had led to this, a small, impregnable pocket of warmth and safety carved from the heart of the storm itself. She could feel the vibration of the blizzard through the soles of her feet, a deep tremor that ran through the bedrock. She was inside the mountain, and the mountain was holding her safe. She thought of the settlement below, of their wooden houses with their rattling shutters and countless cracks for the wind to find. She imagined the cold seeping through the floorboards, the snow piling in great drifts against the walls, the constant, draining battle to keep the fires fed against the onslaught. They had called her foolish. They had called her an outcast. They had sentenced her to death in the wilderness. But their conventional wisdom, their reliance on wood and speed, had made them vulnerable. They had built upon the land. She had built within it. The irony was as sharp and cold as the wind outside. Her place of exile had become the only true sanctuary. For 3 days, the world was an abyss of white noise and fury. In the settlement of Providence, existence was reduced to a desperate, shivering battle for warmth. The blizzard was more than snow, it was a relentless siege. The The wind, armed with ice particles as sharp as sand, scoured the wooden walls of the cabins, finding every chink, every poorly sealed joint, and driving the cold deep inside. Families huddled together under every blanket they owned, their faces illuminated by the greedy flames of fires that seemed to produce more smoke than heat. The precious stockpiles of firewood were dwindling at an alarming rate. The storm was consuming their fuel as ravenously as it consumed the landscape. Reese fought his way from his small cabin to the elders, a rope tied between the two buildings, his only guide in the blinding chaos. The snow was chest-deep in places, the drifts sculpted into monstrous, alien shapes by the wind. When he finally stumbled inside the elders' home, the scene was grim. Corbin, the pragmatic leader, looked gaunt, his face a mask of exhaustion and dawning horror. His wife and grandchildren were wrapped in quilts by a fire that was little more than a pile of glowing embers. "The roof of the meeting house has collapsed," Corbin said, his voice a hoarse rasp. "The weight of the snow. The Jensen's barn is gone." The wind took it apart piece by piece. Reese looked around the room. The cold was a physical presence, a guest that would not leave. Ice crystals bloomed on the inside of the walls. A small drift of fine snow was growing under the door. Their homes, which had seemed so sturdy and safe in the autumn sun, were proving to be little more than wooden tents against this elemental rage. "We misjudged it," Corbin murmured, staring into the dying fire as if seeking an answer in the coals. "We thought it would be like the other winters." His pragmatism, the very quality that made him a leader, had become a liability. He had prepared for the expected, but the land did not deal in the expected. It dealt in overwhelming force. They had lived on the surface of this place for years, but they had never understood it. They had imposed their will upon it, but they had never listened to its secrets. They had seen the woman's solitary labor in the hills as the desperate folly of an outcast. Now, in the frozen heart of the storm, a terrible seed of doubt began to sprout in the elder's mind. They were the ones who were exposed. They were the ones trapped in fragile shelters. She, in her stone hollow, was somewhere else entirely. The thought was a chilling one, that the person they had cast out to die might be the only one who was truly safe. On the fourth day, the wind slackened. It did not die, but its maniacal scream subsided to a low, mournful howl. The snow continued to fall, but it was softer now, no longer driven with horizontal fury. A grey, featureless twilight replaced the blinding whiteout. It was a lull, a breath taken in the heart of the storm. It was their only chance. Corbin gathered the strongest of the remaining men, Reese among them. Their faces were pinched and grey with cold. The task ahead was monumental. They had to break a trail through the drifts, to check on the outer cabins, to find a way to the woman's cave. The elder's motivation was no longer pride or authority, it was a desperate, primal need to know. To see what had become of the woman he had condemned. They moved like ghosts through a transformed world. The landscape was unrecognizable, a sea of snow broken only by the peaks of the highest roofs. The effort was staggering. Each step was a plunge into deep, soft powder that stole their breath and their strength. It took them over 2 hours to cover the half-mile to the foothills. As they drew closer to the cliff face, they saw it. A thin, unwavering plume of grey smoke, rising straight into the still air from what looked like a simple fissure in the rock. It was a sign of life so calm, so incongruous in the midst of the surrounding devastation, that it stopped them in their tracks. They stared, their breath misting in the frigid air. They trudged up the final slope, their boots sinking deep, until they stood before the wall of mortared stone. It was banked high with snow, but the entrance, a dark rectangle covered by a heavy hide, was clear. The wall itself seemed to emanate a faint warmth. Corbin, his face a mask of humility and awe, stepped forward. He raised a gloved hand and knocked on the rough-hewn doorframe next to the hide. The sound was swallowed by the snow and the silence. He knocked again, harder this time. "Hello," he called out, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" The hide was pulled aside. Anya stood there, framed by the darkness of the cave behind her. The warm, golden light of her fire spilled out, illuminating the falling snowflakes. She was not gaunt or frostbitten. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. The warmth that flowed from the opening was a physical thing, a wave of life in the deadening cold. Behind her, they could see the clean-swept stone floor, the steady fire burning in the hearth, the great dog lifting its head to watch them. Corbin looked at the solid stone walls, at the peaceful, impossible warmth. He looked at the woman he had cast out. He removed his hat, his grey hair immediately catching the falling snow. "We were wrong," he said. The words were simple, stripped of all authority, all pride. They were the sound of a world turned upside down. "We were wrong. Can you help us? The children, they are so cold." She did not answer with words. She simply stepped back, holding the hide covering aside, a silent invitation. One by one, they stumbled in, bringing the biting cold with them. They peeled off their snow-caked gloves and hats, their movements stiff and clumsy. The warmth of the small space was a shock, a physical blow that made their frozen extremities ache and tingle. They stared at the interior of her creation, their eyes wide with disbelief. The walls were rough-hewn stone, the ceiling a natural arch of rock, but it was a home. A small stack of firewood lay neatly by the hearth. A makeshift shelf held her meager supplies. The air was dry and smelled of wood smoke and warm earth. It was the most secure place any of them had been in for days. Anya moved to the fire, adding a few pieces of wood. She filled a small pot with melted snow and set it near the flames to warm. Her movements were unhurried, imbued with a quiet dignity that left no room for gloating or resentment. She was not their savior, nor their judge. She was simply a woman in a warm room, and they were people in need of warmth. The first to be brought were the children. Reese and the other men ferried them over, wrapped in every blanket they could find. They arrived, whimpering and blue with cold, and Anya took them in, settling them on the blanket Reese had brought her, now laid out on the warmest part of the floor near the fire. She gave them warm water to sip. Slowly, the color returned to their cheeks, the shivering subsided, and they fell into an exhausted sleep, lulled by the crackling fire and the deep sense of security that permeated the stone shelter. Soon, the cave was filled with the weakest members of the community. They sat huddled together, their backs against the solid walls, their faces turned toward the fire as if it were a shrine. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. Their entire worldview, their hierarchy of strength and wisdom, had been shattered and remade in this small, hand-carved hollow. Corbin sat apart from the others, near the entrance, watching Anya as she moved about her small domain. He watched her check on the sleeping children, her touch gentle. He watched her stoke the fire, her movements efficient and sure. He was seeing not the outcast widow, the problem to be solved, but a woman of immense, quiet strength, whose knowledge ran deeper than his own. She had not relied on the community's approval or their methods. She had listened to the land, trusted an older wisdom, and forged her survival with her own 2 hands. The blizzard raged again outside for another day, but inside the cave, there was only the gentle sound of the fire and the soft breathing of sleeping children. Her exile had become their salvation. The stone that they had dismissed had become the cornerstone of their survival.